Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? All right. So I'm Alexis Macklin. I'm an analyst with Greenlight Insights, and I focus primarily on consumer media and entertainment, particularly with immersive media and entertainment like VR and AR. So I'm sure you're kind of wondering, why am I talking about VR and eSports? So that's kind of a strange mix right now. It's very early days, but I'll explore what's going on right now, what's coming up down the road, and how it could be successful. So within the last 5 years, we've really seen a growth within esports in general, and that's largely been brought on by online streaming. So this is really great since esports has been around since the early 70s. But this online streaming platform has really helped it grow, which is great for gaming studios and gamers too. It's a very big opportunity, but what we're seeing now is a pretty robust ecosystem and a distribution model across different games and different sites. So when we look at esports and we compare it to the average cost per megabyte by broadband and DSL, we see as the cost goes down, the rise of esports market size goes up, especially with about 2010 is a good indicator for this. So this is when we start to see Hulu and Netflix pop up, and this is why they're able to keep such a low cost for their video on demand platform. So we've seen a huge growth within these years to reaching about $1 billion market predicted by 2019. So generally what we're seeing so far with esports in this streaming age, if you will, is that we're seeing kind of a life cycle come about. So we see a new game get released, a mass following with adoption that could even happen before the game is actually released with a pre-launch or a beta. And then we start to see mass streaming. So we're seeing streamers put on videos of gameplay, and other gamers that are fans of the game come to this to learn how to improve. And then we eventually see that support from the gaming studio for a esports tournament or league. So I'm sure you know about Fortnite. So even though there's an extremely popular game and we saw a lot of mass adoption, we saw that the actual esports league and tournament, the gameplay kind of change up as the tournament went around. So they've had a couple of goes at this, and they're still perfecting this. So although this cycle seems to be there, there's still some room for development that the game developers specifically have to work on. So you probably knew all about that I just presented, but why does VR fit into any of this? It's still a niche, so why am I talking about VR and esports? Particularly when we look at consumers, we see an interest there, specifically with VR. So in our 2018 consumer survey that we put out, where we survey over 4,000 US consumers, we saw that esports fans, so the consumers that watch esports 3 or more times a week, we saw that 91% of them were interested in VR gaming, as opposed to the general public that had about 65% of interest. Esports fans, VR gaming for them ranked highly in the top 3, whereas the general public, it kind of went towards the bottom half of the different categories. And then we've also seen a high adoption with esports fans as well. So about 70% of esports fans say they own a VR headset. Of course, that could be anything from a Samsung Gear VR to an HTC Vive. So there's a lot of room there, whereas the general public is about 50%. So that's great. There's interest there, but we do have a lot of issues. So the first one is there's a low consumer headset adoption. So we're still at least a couple years away to start to have mass adoption. So that makes VR esports a niche within a niche within a niche. But there's some opportunity there, which I'll go into. We also see a low streaming presence. So not only is VR a low streamed platform on Twitch and YouTube, there's also kind of lower views as opposed to other games. The highest right now is VR chat, but we don't have enough time to get into that. The game right now that is second highest is Beat Saber, which we'll talk about. There's also a lack of content. And when I mean lack of content, I mean lack of good, diverse content. So we're seeing a lot of the same things, which doesn't particularly prove the value proposition to consumers right now. So that's also a problem that's leading into adoption. But the biggest thing is VR is hard to watch. There's a lot of different issues with it. So broadcasters and streamers haven't figured out the best way to broadcast gameplay. So how are you going to show the actual real life gamer? How are you going to show their first person point of view? How are you going to do the spectator mode? There's a lot of questions there, and it gets kind of messy. We also see a kind of hard time creating avatars. So the gamers themselves don't have full body tracking on them. So we get some wonky arms where maybe they're going like this, but their avatar is all over the place. So that also has a hard time for viewers to watch. So this is complicated for these specific hurdles to overcome. So although all of those challenges, we do see a VR league right now called the VR Challenger League, and that's put on by Oculus, Intel, and ESL. So although we saw that cycle of a game having mass adoption, mass following, and then it comes to an eSports league, this is kind of messing all that up. So the VR Challenger League has a couple different goals, but money isn't necessarily one of them, in more of an indirect type of way. So the first goal is to create more of a widespread understanding of VR. So to see that it is social, it can be interactive, and it can be competitive gameplay. And also to showcase different good games within VR. The second is to really grow adoption through that. So the big thing is that a lot of people don't understand or know what VR games are particularly. They can think of what VR is, but they don't necessarily know the games in it. So this is to help bring awareness to the VR gaming community. Right now it's still relatively small. It's only in its second year, and it's primarily based in the United States and the United Kingdom, so it's not an international league, but it is the first of its kind so far. So since that creation, we've seen a lot of development on the VR game side to try to adopt a better format for esports. So more competitive gameplay, PvP or co-ops, that you could be able to play in an esports league. So the best example of this is Lone Echo. So when it came out, it was more of a story player mode, a one-person type of game, a dynamic game. Then we're starting, once the VR Challenger League came out, we saw the creation of Echo Arena, which is more of a soccer and zero gravity kind of Tron-like environment. But now we're starting to see another adoption of that as gamers really liked the hand-to-hand combat that was in Echo Arena, so we have Echo Combat now. So another iteration of that competitive gameplay. There's definitely more examples, but these are the most direct. So we've seen this league come into play. But we necessarily haven't really seen too much of a growth because of that yet. So the way that we can really see this is in Twitch and YouTube, probably one of the biggest streaming platforms that there are for gamers. So we see still relatively low amount of followers and streamers on these platforms for VR games that have esports leagues or tournaments associated with them. So you see with the Twitch followers, they're in more thousands, whereas actual more traditional esports are in millions. And the number of Twitch streamers are under 100, whereas with actual more professional widespread games, we see that in thousands. So there's quite a bit of growth still to be reached here. Something to note too is that Sprint Vector and Beat Saber are the only titles on here that have really a cross-platform presence, not just on a PC, but also on a gaming console. So when we look at the future of VR and esports, we can really look to a couple of different areas where this growth will come. So the first one is Beat Saber. So it's the closest VR game to some sort of mass following. Just a quick poll, has anyone seen this video or heard of Beat Saber before? Okay. And then how many people own a VR headset or work in VR? Okay, so there's quite a bit more people who have seen Beat Saber or heard about it than own a VR headset. So it's very interesting because it has 10 times the following of the other esports titles that I was showing up there. So it's interesting because, especially on YouTube, Echo Arena, the Unspoken, also with Onward, we see that the view counts are in about 1 million, but the subscriber counts of the channels that are posting them are in tens of millions. So think 2 million views on this video, but there's 50 million subscribers to this specific channel. Whereas Beat Saber, we see the opposite. So there's millions of views of Beat Saber videos, but thousands of subscribers for these channels. So we see that kind of flipped, where we see consumers are more interested in this specific game than the influencer that may be posting about it. So when we look at this too, we can compare, as in this chart, it's kind of hard to see on the projection, but the size of the circles represent the amount of current ownership. The bottom is the overall difficulty score, taking in game mechanics, mental strategy, gameplay, and then the peak viewers of a stream or a match. So we see Beat Saber kind of on its own level there. And it hasn't officially been in an esports tournament or league yet, though that is coming. But Beat Saber is very approachable as compared to the other games. It may be hard to master, but it's easy to understand. You take 2 of your lightsabers and you hit boxes in the direction and you dodge objects. That's pretty easy to get, it's approachable, but it's interesting to watch someone play at a higher level. Whereas something like Unspoken, there's a lot of strategy involved. The players themselves are teleporting, so it's kind of hard to handle watching. And beyond that, Beat Saber already has a built-in mechanic, so for best practices on how to stream. So even before this launched or went into beta, the developers posted this video, and it shows you how they foresee people to share their experience in more the mixed casting kind of way, where you see the game you also see the real-life player. So another example that we're looking at is VR games that are specifically approaching esports. So we see Kite and Lightning's Babylon Battle Royale as an example of this. So it's a pretty funny backstory. There's immortal babies that have BattleBot competitions to try to gain social prowess in this utopia community. But the actual VR audience can watch around the arena there. So what's interesting about this is not only is the audience in VR watching the match, but they can also interact. So they can take objects and throw it into the arena, whether that's helpful or a trap that can hurt opponents. So this is definitely something that is being looked at. How can an audience watch a specific gameplay within VR? So another thing to keep in mind when approaching VR and esports is currently right now there's a growing audience on Facebook rather than Twitch or YouTube. So these numbers are also kind of hard to see, but they're pretty respectable. Onward has about 500,000 views on its most watched VR Challenger League match. Echo Arena has about 250,000, and the Unspoken is a little behind that at about 200,000. Of course, there's a lot of factors that go into this. What accounts for a view? It could pop up in a feed and someone could pause on it for a couple seconds as they scroll through, but it is touching a significant amount of people, a lot more than Twitch or YouTube is. So it's something to keep in mind. So as we're looking a bit beyond this about how this might change a little bit, we can also look at AR. So an example of this is Hado in Japan. So this started in Japan. It's a AR dodgeball game, much like Dragon Ball Z, you're throwing fireballs against opponents, but it started to grow an international following. So now it has representatives at the US and also Europe and other Asian countries as well. So it doesn't have in-home adoption yet. It's more of an out-home experience, but this is the first kind of example that we're seeing of AR eSports, which will become something to really take account to into the future, especially with mobile AR. So right now, within the next couple years, we've seen a bit more development on multiplayer and also PvP experiences, especially since Apple and Google have started to create and work in shared experiences into ARKit and ARCore. So as we see these games come out within the next couple years, we should see more mobile AR adoption in gaming, which is exciting. Definitely a bit different than those Pokemon Go type mobile games. And lastly, the out-of-home market is very important for esports. So what we're seeing right now beyond the professional league that we were talking about, the VR Challenger League, we're seeing it grow in local markets as well. So much like when esports first started in the 70s, we see kind of amateur casual tournaments that have very small prizes. It's more about loving the game that small out-of-home VR operators are putting on. We have seen a growth in more professional tournaments as well. So Alienware hosted one with Sprint Vector in Vegas, and Springboard VR has announced that they'll be hosting a Beat Saber VR esports tournament across 50 different international locations. So that will be the first truly international reaching VR esports tournament. But this is very important to the ecosystem for the small VR operator. So something that we're starting to see is there's kind of two different VR gamers that come about. We're seeing the competitors and the discoverers. So the discoverers are the ones that pick up random objects that you never thought anyone would do in a game. Pick it up, look at it, throw it maybe. They want to take their time, they want to be immersed, they want to see the full story. They definitely want to take their time within the experience. Whereas the competitors are more about the gameplay, they're, about the competition. So they're about playing against other people, whether they know them or not, multiplayer or co-op or PvP. But their whole point of view is to come back and get better, and this is more of the bread and butter of the smaller VR operator rather than the discoverers, because the discoverers will pay more but maybe not come back as frequently. They're the ones that will pay that $35 for a 20-minute experience for the Void. a Star Wars experience, whereas the competitors will want more of that monthly pass that they can come back and continuously play. So the small operators are looking more for that competitive gameplay rather than a more immersive, long storytelling experience. So to kind of wrap it all up, although VR is pretty niche, especially within eSports, doesn't mean that eventually it won't become a important sector, not only within VR, but eventually maybe eSports as well. So we're going to see a bit more hopeful years to come, especially with standalone headset adoption and introduction, prices rise, but at the end of the day, it all ends on content. So something to keep in mind is not only building VR experiences that have a multiplayer component to it, but also about how it is to actually watch the gameplay. So it's another extra step to think about. And with that, I try to speed up so we could save on time. Perfect.